Cool. Well, welcome everyone. Great to have you all here. My name is Sana Keshtkaran. I'm a career and executive coach based in San Francisco Bay Area. I have over 8 years of experience working with corporate companies like Facebook, Airbnb, GitHub, GoPro, and also working with organizational development consulting firms. I love coaching and I love helping people with multicultural backgrounds level up in their careers. And the topic of feedback is one of my most favorite topics just because I know it can ruin or improve a lot of things, particularly professional relationships that we have. So with that, I'll get started with the agenda. I'll give you first some statistical background on feedback. We'll go over the psychology and physiology of feedback, effectively receiving feedback, and also how to handle negative feedback. Also, go over a step by step framework on how to give effective feedback, some do's and don'ts, and finally, building a feedback culture. So Gallup, which is a company that conducts a lot of organizational research, has some cool statistics on the topic of feedback. So on the quantity side of things, meaning on the number of times that people receive feedback, they shared that 28% of employees receive feedback a few times a year, and an additional 19% of employees receive feedback only once a year or less. So that's very low number. But at the same time, we also are having issues or challenges on the quality of these feedback too. So only 4.5% of managers agree that they are successful or effective feedback givers, and only 26% of employees believe that the feedback that they receive actually help with their work. So it's both on the quantity and the quality side of it. And tells us that a large number of employees are not receiving the help that they actually need to be successful in their roles. And that's why it's a very important topic to discuss so that we can learn how to give feedback and also how to receive feedback so that hand in hand it can help create a better feedback culture at companies. And I forgot to mention also, as I go and go on to different slides, feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. But towards the end, we'll also have another opportunity for you to ask your questions. So feel free to do it however you like. But yeah, I wanted to start with asking you all how you feel about feedback. Is feedback something that you look forward to when you hear the word? Is it something that makes you just want to run, makes you anxious potentially? Let's hear from some of you.
I'm happy to go. So for me, I actually love to hear feedback. I actually, but I think the frequency of feedback and how the person giving me the feedback articulates their thoughts and why I should kind of do what they think I should do. It makes it important because I also have received feedback that were not constructive, or was maybe too judgmental, or a very narrow view of what was going on. So, but generally, I love hearing feedback.
Great, that's great to hear. And you made a really good point about feeling judged or feeling that the feedback is being judgmental as opposed to constructive. That's very important. Does anyone else wants to share?
So two people have said feedback is a gift, and also someone else has typed in feedback is how I know I'm on the right track. So
Mm, nice, really good point. So it's great to have to hear that everyone does see. Seems like most people are seeing feedback as an opportunity to grow, but as we all know, it depends also on how it's delivered to us. So that makes a huge difference. Cool. So with that, let's talk about why giving and receiving feedback is difficult. And I think it's really important to talk about this to accept and acknowledge that it's okay if we all feel like sometimes going to feedback sessions can be challenging. At certain points when there is a lot at stake, we might feel like we want to escape. And this is the reason. So, from an evolution perspective, we all want to be loved, to be respected, to feel like we belong to our communities. And feeling that judgment that Puria mentioned or that criticism can make us feel like we're probably not enough or not living up to that person's expectation or our society's expectation. And that creates a social pain in us. And what's interesting is that our body, or I should say brain and body altogether, processes social pain similarly as to it processes physical pain. And we'll get into the details of how our brain actually does that. But what's important to note for now is that this is the social pain that makes us want to escape feedback and make us want to avoid even giving feedback to others, because we feel like, well, we don't want to hurt others people's feelings. We don't want them to feel like they're not being respected, or maybe they're not enough. So sometimes, even if we are very compassionate people, we love that person who is on the receiving end, but we are just afraid of how they're going to take it. And what happens in the brain from a physiological perspective? So we all in our brains have what's called amygdala, and amygdala, we have two of it on both sides. It's very small, it's almond shaped, and it's the part of the brain that processes emotions. And so imagine when someone gives you feedback that is not delivered effectively. It's the amygdala part of your brain that gets activated. It gets a rush of blood flow and gets activated. And when amygdala is activated, it kind of blocks or slows the process in your brain that helps you think rationally or logically. And so this overreaction to stress is referred to as amygdala hijack by Daniel Goleman. And Daniel Goleman is a psychologist and emotional intelligence author that talked about this phenomenon. And so they did a lot of studies with MRIs, where they would scan the brain of people who were doing different things. And they noticed that this amygdala, when it gets this rush of blood flow, it connects a current experience that you're having that might not be that stressful. It connects it to an experience that you've probably had in the past, a past memory, something that you've learned, and helps guide the action based on that past experience. And so imagine when you're doing camping and there is a bear and potentially could attack you. So that's a real life danger and attack. And so at something in a scenario like that, it actually makes sense that will feel threatened, and we will be thankful to our amygdala that it lets us know that there's a danger. But in real life or in our social life, a lot of times, unfortunately, it gets activated. Our amygdala gets activated when it doesn't really have to. It's not that big of a deal. It's just someone is trying to help us with our job, to help us improve, but we think this is like a bear attack. It's worth noting, though, that our amygdala is able to process positive emotions as well, like awards, but it's best known for its role in detecting danger and attacks. And some signs of amygdala hijack and why it's important is that when you give feedback to others, it's important that you notice if they're getting into this amygdala hijack, and also to notice it for yourself, because it's not just the person on the receiving end who might experience amygdala hijack. If they, for some reason, they do actually get into the state, they might respond in a way that is aggressive, and so it might put you ultimately in that state too. So it's important to realize or notice the signs and try to calm yourself down as much as you can. You help the other person as well. So just in real life, when there is a bear attack or any other physical attack, there are usually three defense mechanisms that we use to protect ourselves. It's fight, flight, or freeze. So fight is obvious. Flight is when you just want to escape the scene and not be there. And freeze when you have complete shutdown. You just don't know what to do, so you just stay there in the moment and see what happens next. And so we have the same mechanism also in case of a perceived threat to our identity, status, relationships, jobs, or anything socially. But the way that we show it in social lives or in professional lives is different. So in the fight scenario, if someone gives me a feedback that is not handled effectively, if I get into the fight mode, I might increase my volume. I might start using sarcasm, hopefully not. Or I might flight, means I might just give short answers like yes, no. And with my body language, it might actually be very obvious when I have my crossed arms, or if my feet are going like toward the exit door because I'm so in rush to get out of that room where I received that feedback, or I might freeze. It happens, it might be that someone sent me an email sharing their feedback with me, and I just don't know what to do with all those information that seems inaccurate. I don't know where they came from. So I might just not know what to respond with and how to handle it. So that's a freeze situation. So let's pause here. I wanna see if you all remember a time in the past or recently where you feel like you got into the amygdala hijack, and what are some ways that you get yourself out of it, or you got yourself out of it. Anyone wants to share?
For me, it's been like breathing. I just stay calm through breathing.
Great. Yeah, that's a great one. Anyone else wants to share? Cool.
So someone has said reflect on why is the other person doing it.
No.
Not sure.
Sorry, what was it?
Yeah, I meant to say that I just reflect on why is the other person giving me this feedback? What is the intention?
Yeah, and it's very tempting also always to want to know where that's coming from, what's the intention, and it's a valid thought to have when someone shares that with us. And we'll cover that too in terms of when it is effective to think about intentions and when it is not as helpful to think about that right in the beginning of when the feedback is being shared. But thanks for sharing that. By the way, I'm not sure where these lines just came from on my slides, the yellow.
Oh, that's okay. So Parham says, when my boss's boss criticizes me.
Willing to share if that's because of the authority that he has, or maybe potentially the way that he usually delivers feedback that is not as effective. Any insight into that?
I don't know if Parham wants to unmute. Okay, we can.
Sure, no worries. Now, let me see if
when he's ready.
And I can see the chat here too now, so that would be helpful. Cool. So some tips to get out of the amygdala hijack. There are technical side of things, and then there's also the mental and body side of things. So it's really important that you can connect to the present moment and see what's happening in the moment. So one of you, I forgot the name, sorry, and you mentioned that you want to think about the intention. So it is just very normal to want to know what the intention is, but in the present moment, it's great if we can focus on what's being shared, what are the data points, and try to slowly get that conversation to the point where they can also share the intention and what the impacts are as well. And focus on your body language. If you have a fist, try to see, where that, if that's something that you can release in your body, the energy. Breathing, as Arash mentioned. And this is my favorite one, the learning and development piece, is that whenever I feel like I'm getting defensive, I'm getting into that amygdala hijack, I remind myself that I'm a person who loves to learn and improve myself, and I reframe it as an opportunity to grow. And that already releases a lot of negative energy. And lastly, avoiding reactions you might regret later. This is another tempting one. I had a similar situation, or I had a situation recently where I heard it wasn't exactly feedback, but kind of a feedback where it just put me in that amygdala hijack where my emotions were just all over the place. I was kind of angry, and I was close to making a decision that I know it wasn't going to benefit me. It wasn't going to harm anyone, of course, but it was something that it was a decision I was making out of just being so angry in the moment. So knowing that, being aware that I'm not in the right situation or in the right state to make any important decision is very, very important. So always allow yourself 2 hours, a whole day, or just 24 hours to relax, to calm down, and make any decisions you might want to make after that space. So let's talk about receiving feedback. It's very important to know how to receive feedback. And that's because, first of all, a lot of employees reported that they prefer to receive feedback as opposed to giving feedback. And so it creates a really good, it gives us a good foundation for creating a good feedback culture, as we can focus on how these people can receive feedback in a positive way, and that it's encouraging to those who are giving feedback as well, so that it's not as scary anymore for those who are giving feedback to get into these conversations. And here is my suggestion in terms of how you can respond whenever next time when someone asks you if I can share some feedback with you. You'll respond with saying, yes, please, I would love for you to share your observations. And every part of this statement is key. And I'll unpack that for you now. So when you start with yes, please, it already shows that you're confident, you show appreciation for the feedback, that you're willing to learn, and you have growth mindset. And also the word sharing it's just like when you say sharing is caring. It's a lot more positive than when we use the word telling. Telling has a little bit more imbalance in the authority level and how we think of ourselves and the other person, whereas sharing, it creates an environment where we are an ally to each other, and we're trying to create something together. It has this collaborative type of vibe into it. And the most important thing here, I think, is the word observation. When you encourage people to share their observation as opposed to their opinions or feelings or thoughts, you're encouraging them to share their data points that are objective, that has nothing to do with their opinions or feelings. And that makes the feedback a lot more constructive, of course. And it also shows that you're appreciative of their feedback. And once they share their feedback with you, you want to respond with appreciation and willingness to learn. And always remember that you can guide the conversation using the words, because language matters a lot. And onto handling negative feedback. So we talked about how you can get yourself out of amygdala hijack using breathing and being mindful. There are also some things you can do to put your defenses down that are a little bit more technical in the session. So again, you adopt curiosity mindset. You ask for examples. We are going to get into the 4-step framework for giving effective feedback. But it's important to know that not everyone takes workshops on how to give feedback. Not everyone does it as well. So as someone who is on the receiving end, know that you do have a lot of power in guiding that conversation and asking them for the right type of information to be shared. So if they don't ask, if they don't share observations or examples, you can ask for it. Tell them what is the specific thing and what is the specific date and time that this happens, so that I can act on it. And focus on the topic. Instead of focusing on the other person or on yourself, focus on what exactly is being shared. Be present, and always remember that you have until you have after the whole session to decide, whether you agree or disagree and what you want to do to move forward, and even during the session. But while they are sharing their data points with you, try to be present and don't focus on how you're going to respond. And here's the 4-step framework for giving effective feedback. First, you want to invite them and get their yes. Never ever share feedback with someone if they haven't accepted to be part of that conversation. Although I shouldn't say never, because there's some exceptions where some people do prefer that you don't let them in advance, you just surprise them. Most of the time that's not encouraged, but for the most part, yeah, you want to let them know in advance, whether it's by telling them, hey, is that okay if I put some time on your calendar to share some feedback about this project that we just ramped up? Or even while you're in the session, you're about to share something, always ask them, can I share some feedback with you? They might not be in the right situation, the right timing, and the state of mind, so they can always say no, or they can always say, maybe do it tomorrow. So you give them that opportunity, you put some power in their hands too. And also, this is an actual great negotiation technique as well, that whenever you want to get into a conversation, important conversation with another person, it's important that you get their micro yes, they say first, and let them know, let them feel that they have some power in the conversation. And then you share, and I will also share that this helps with reducing the chance of amygdala hijack, because they feel that they have power. It's not that they don't have any say in that conversation. And then you share data points with them. As we mentioned earlier, this is all about observations. This is about exact things that you saw. So for example, if I were in a meeting and I say, that thing, the way that you behaved in that meeting yesterday was very unprofessional. I'm not sharing data points, because when I'm saying that was not professional, being professional or not is something that can be very subjective. It can be very different from person to person. And it doesn't help the other person understand what actions they have to take in order to be more professional. Whereas if I'm very specific and say, yesterday in our 4 p.m. meeting, you interrupted me a few times when I was sharing my point. So this is very specific. You're letting them know when exactly it happened and what was the behavior. And then you share the impact. This is called sometimes the impact statement. It can be the negative consequence or the positive impact if they stop that behavior. So an example again for that is that I could continue on with saying, when you do that, it makes me feel like my opinion or my points in the meeting are not being heard or not as important, and that doesn't make me feel like I belong in the team. And especially if this is something ongoing, you really want to set standards for how they behave, or even if it's just a one-off thing. Feel free to always share your opinion, I should say actually not opinion, your observations, but also back it up with how it makes you feel as the impact. That's where your opinion usually comes in. And then you start a genuine conversation by asking, what are your thoughts? How do you see it? So you invite them to continue conversation, as opposed to saying, yes, that's my opinion, you're not professional, and go figure out how you want to handle it, and then move on. Does anyone have any questions so far? All right, great. So let's talk about some of the, I want to get into the do's and don'ts, but before I do that, I want to ask you all, what are some of your pet peeves in a feedback conversation? What are some things that people might do that you absolutely don't like? Maybe things that put you in that amygdala hijack. Poria, do you have one?
No, I'm thinking right now.
Someone said, Matthew
Bad
said,
tone.
bad tone. Yep, that's very important. I'm glad you brought that up. Exactly. Makes a big difference. A raised voice. Outright denying the facts Exactly. Using curse words. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's bad, especially in a professional context.
Sana, what can we do if someone is not very open to feedback?
hmm That's a great question. I would say first checking with ourselves if that's true or accurate. Sometimes we think people might not be open to feedback. Maybe we have heard from others, but who knows? Maybe when others shared feedback with them, they didn't do it effectively. So that person is really defensive right now to any feedback from that team. So I would say, I would personally encourage that you give it a shot for yourself and see how it works using this framework or any other framework that has been researched to give results. But ultimately, also, there are some people who are unfortunately just not open to feedback. They're either they see it as too much threat that they cannot handle. So I would say in those cases, try to give them mini feedback sessions. So as opposed to telling them the whole thing or focusing on a big thing, try with smaller pieces. And I would say, especially with managers or authorities, that seems to be a little bit more challenging. Try to connect it to the big impact that it has for them. So if it's a leader and they're handling a whole team, and you have feedback that is relevant to the team, to the projects that they're doing, try to connect that, try to make that connection in their head of how this behavior that they could improve potentially can impact their team, their project, and how they are being viewed. Sometimes when we receive, when we give feedback, especially as direct reports to managers, we forget that um, we focus too much on what's in it for us, and we don't share too much about how it's going to benefit them as well. So I would say, especially for people who are challenging to work with, and when it comes to feedback, point out what is going to be in it for them. Is that
Very
helpful?
interesting. Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, what you said resonates a lot, which is uh, kind of give them mini feedback, but also communicate the impact of their behavior, or
Mm-hmm.
if they listen to feedback on the overall business or for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Great, great,
So
great.
someone said, I recently read a book, Radical Candor by Kim Scott. Love the fact that she adds care dimension to giving feedback. Yeah, I
Mm,
think that's a fantastic book. I serendipitously came across it a few weeks ago too, and gave it a read, and it's amazing. So,
oh,
uh,
great. Thank you. Yeah, I've heard that book, but I never read it. So definitely writing it down. Thank you. And I'm curious to know how they frame the care dimension. Is it more on the empathy side of things, meaning you put in to context like what that person is coming from? If you're willing to share, I would love to hear more about that.
sure, I can
So,
share. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, uh, from my perspective, care means you show that you really care. You're not being mean. You really care that you want to help the other person. So before you give a negative feedback, especially, you tell the person or you show in some way that you really are doing it because you're well meaning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And when you give a feedback at that time, it is well received.
I love that. Great. Yes, for sure. Yeah, I definitely have felt that too with managers that I've had in the past, where sometimes the feedback would just come to me when we didn't have as any relationship established, whereas comparing it to other manager relationships where there was already a good relationship, I know that they care about how I feel in the team and how I'm doing my job and how much I care about developing myself all the time. And so when they come from that type of place, or that with that intention and knowing that they care, it makes a huge difference. So thank you so much for sharing that. Matthew, I noticed you unmuted yourself, I think. Did you want to?
Yeah, I was gonna say, there is some, if it's in person or if there's some physiological things, maybe pointing with one's heart like towards the person and just uncrossing and breathing before speaking.
Mm,
And I think that goes a long way. And just a neutral face, a smile that's open and listening. And I think that goes both ways, either giving or receiving. It allows for the conversation to flow a lot smoother than
yeah.
otherwise.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the body language. Yeah, sometimes even without, I forgot the statistic. I think it was like something around 70% that we communicate through our nonverbal communications, basically our tone, like not through things that are not words. So through our tone and also our body language. So a lot of times, even without the person talking from their body language, we can notice, oh no, this is big danger. So it makes a big difference for sure.
Absolutely.
Thanks for sharing that. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So yeah, on to some do's and don'ts. Please be timely. Don't wait until the performance reviews in professional context, but even in personal relationships, I would say when you wait, first of all, that person is not going to remember what the situation or incident was. And also, you treat them very unfairly if you don't give them the opportunity to correct themselves, to see how they can actually be better. And so at the end, like if you wait like 6 months or 3 months, and unfortunately most of the time, and a lot of the times in corporate, it's only in performance reviews that happens like once or twice a year that you give people to give feedback, but it really shouldn't be that way. Recent studies show that even if the performance reviews happen once or twice a year, none of those reviews should be a surprise. So people should have already shared those feedback, whether it's from the manager, direct reports, or like in the 360 reviews. And no matter how it's shared, they shouldn't be hearing something, especially if it's a bigger thing, for the very first time. So always be nice to people and give feedback sooner, because also by the time that you wait, you're not sharing feedback anymore, you're just exploding with a bunch of things that have built up on top of each other. And you want to make it private and face to face. So for feedback that is positive, it's obviously okay to do it in public. People might actually like it more, but you definitely want to make it face to face. Again, there's been research on feedback that was shared in email, and people sometimes think that, well, I'm going to add emojis, or I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about my wording and how I structure my arguments. But the reality is we lose a lot of nuance in those type of interactions where we don't know what their body language is. As Matthew said, we want to know what type of state they are in. We don't know if if we've already put them in an amygdala hijack or not, whether they're about to say something. So it just makes a huge difference. And I know in the COVID world, we don't have the in-person type of interaction, but Zoom can be just fine, a little bit less effective, but still can do a great job. And as we talked already about this, we want to focus on the behavior, not the person and who they are. So when it's already difficult to be in a feedback situation, so when you're attacking the person and their identity and who they are, it makes things a lot more difficult. Whereas if you detach that from if you detach the behavior from who they are, you're just focusing on something that they can change. But when you're focusing on themselves, they will like, I don't know if I can change myself or like my identity. This is just who I am. But you want to remind them that this is about the behavior. And again, don't surprise people unless it's requested otherwise. And this leads me to my next point, which is you want to prepare and tailor the feedback to the person. So there was someone in my team at one point where she said, I just prefer to be surprised when there is feedback. It creates some anxiety for me, especially if the time between, if the time between when they tell me I'm going to give you some feedback is too long until they actually share the feedback. So you want to listen to the people's priority, the preferences, especially if this is a relationship that you have for a long time with your manager, direct report. Ask what their preferred method is, but for the most part, people want to know that feedback is coming their way so that they can prepare themselves mentally. And show empathy. So I want to talk about an important concept in psychology called fundamental attribution error. So imagine when, let's say, I went skiing and I'm just not in a good mood that day and I'm just not doing great and someone is watching me too. Later, when I'm reflecting back, I say, yeah, I just wasn't really good a skier today because the weather was not good and it wasn't just good snow and I wasn't in a good mood. Whereas if I see some other person not doing a great job, I might say, oh, they're just not talented or they're just not skilled enough or something about them as opposed to external factors. Whereas for myself, I just attributed my poor performance all to external factors, nothing about me. And this is an error because we're not sure, we have no idea what's going on in some other person's life and the reason they performed a certain way. And so basically we overestimate the role of external factors for ourselves and we underestimate the role of external factors for others when we were judging a performance. So we want to show empathy. We want to be curious to know, okay, what was going on such and such day when you interrupted me in that meeting? Tell me more about it. Lastly, you want to share positive feedback as well when you have the opportunity so that the person doesn't think that you're only there when it's time to share negative feedback. That when you share positive as well, it builds resilience. It shows that you have a trusting relationship with them where it's about all of you. You care, as we talked about it too. And some things that you want to avoid, please avoid the sandwich approach. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, and it's actually pretty common. But for reasons that I will explain, it's not a good approach for giving feedback. So sandwich approach is just like a sandwich where we have the meat in between and then you have two pieces of bread on top and bottom. So the meat here in this approach is actually the negative feedback that you want to share. It's the only thing that you want the other person know, but you add some positive things as like both breads into it so that it doesn't seem as bad. Overall, it's just a sandwich, not a big deal. But this is not a good idea because first of all, it's not genuine and it's not honest. It shows that you probably are not having a relationship that is based on trust and open conversation. And it can be very misleading because, well, the other person will say they started with something positive, it also ended with something positive. So it must be not a big deal. And that negative thing that they shared is probably not that big. And it also, I think one of the most important reasons it's not a good approach is because it doesn't give you an opportunity to open a conversation where you can get to the bottom of things and see what went wrong, share data points, share impact statements. So it doesn't create that opportunity and it can be just very, very misleading. I'm curious, does anyone have any opinions or experiences with sandwich approach, comparing it to the methodology that I introduced today? Oh, heard someone label it shit sandwich. Very good. That's right. I totally agree. Anyone else wants to share? Cool. And yeah, we talked about this enough, but I'm sharing it everywhere because it's really important. You don't want to avoid, you want to avoid opinions. It's just like when I say, that presentation that you gave yesterday, I just didn't like it. Well, a lot of people don't care what you like or don't like. They want to know what's objectively accurate, what went wrong, what didn't go wrong, and what they can improve on. You also want to avoid humor. There is a right time and place for humor, but feedback sessions are not the place for it. And that's because, again, just like sandwich approach, it can be a little bit misleading and misinterpreted. And here's my pet peeve in feedback sessions, triangulation. And triangulation, we can have a whole session on this. It basically means when you bring a third person to the conversation, but it actually should be just between two people. So when I did something that I could do a better job of, and so someone like maybe a coworker, instead of coming to me to give me feedback, they go to my manager. And in certain situations, it's actually okay to do that. If you've tried it already once or twice or 3 times and you didn't get a result, or you really think maybe both persons think that there is a need for someone else, like a third person, to come and help facilitate the conversation, then there is a good time for that. But always give people the chance to have that conversation with you directly first. And lastly, to build a feedback culture, you want to nurture growth mindset, make mistakes a norm. A lot of companies have this built into their values that we don't care if the project that you start is perfect. Just get it started and make it a norm that as part of the whole process, you're going to make mistakes. We are going to give you feedback because this is a teamwork. No one is going to make this perfect on them by themselves. And so by doing that, you're just creating this space where everyone is constantly giving and receiving feedback. And so no longer feels like this is a random thing in the whole like 6 months. You also want to make it routine by asking for feedback. So there are always going to be managers and coworkers that are just not going to feel good about giving feedback. Especially if you are someone who is with growth mindset, you want to create that space for them. You want to let them know that, hey, every time that you give me feedback, you're helping me so much. So remind them that they're not going to be hurting your feelings. It's about helping you grow. So create that space by constantly asking for feedback if they're not doing that proactively for you. You also want to incorporate it into company values, share the important at interviews, and teach frameworks like this during onboarding to make sure that people have the tools to give effective feedback. And you also want to build it into one-on-one templates. So a lot of the times people get into one-on-one sessions with their manager or direct reports without having a set, I guess, template or guidance onto how the conversation is going to go. But it makes a huge difference when you help create certain or put in certain questions or frameworks on how you're going to have a conversation. So for example, you can say, what are some parts of this project that didn't go as well, or what are some things that are going or I'm doing a great job of. What are some things that as a team we could do better, and make sure that there is opportunity for both people to share that. And it helps with the whole idea of managing up as well, where the other person is also receiving, and then the manager is also receiving feedback. Again, as we were discussing earlier, knowing that there's going to be an impact or a benefit for both people, regardless of their level and authority in the team. And lastly, and very, very importantly, you want to lead by example. The more you ask for feedback, the more people know that it's okay to continue asking and giving feedback, and they will learn from you as well. With that, I'm going to open it up to any questions you might have. And I'm also putting my calendar link here for any of you who might want to continue the conversation or have any coaching questions that you might have. You can also send me your questions and, of course, feedback as well to my email if there is any. So what questions do y'all have?
Awesome. This was great. Maybe I can start off. So, Sana, I'm thinking of an incident where I had a boss who was really not good at giving feedback or objective feedback. And I would actively seek his advice, but his feedback just weren't specific or constructive in a way that to like give me insight so I can do my job better moving forward, or so I can grow really quickly. You kind of touched on it in how important we are as receiver of feedback in making sure that we're receiving good feedback. But can you share a little bit more on how we can actively manage our boss so that they give us more specific feedback in terms of how we should approach them and specific questions to ask, or like guide the conversation?
Yeah, great question. So as we talked, I think depending on the other person's style, you want to dig deeper and deeper into detail. So see where they are in terms of details and try to take it to the next level. So it would be helpful if you share potential like how they communicate things with you or what things you've tried. But what I have in my mind is that they might say, that project just didn't go well, and so you want to say, okay, can you tell me, can you help me understand which parts of it or from what metrics perspective do you think it didn't go well? So they'll say, yeah, from just like technical, and then also from the communication perspective. And if you still, and I think it's fair to want to know more details, even in whether in the same session or in the following session, you can follow up and say, okay, I dig deeper a little bit on these areas. I noticed that I did this in communication, but curious to know if you could share with me exactly how, in what ways I could improve this. Curious to know your thoughts. What do you think about that?
But yeah, no, I think it's great. My the example I have in mind, a lot of time it just felt like the person just doesn't care enough to think very deeply or really spend the time to think about how I could do something better. He would just be very critical of everything that I do. So he would give me the feedback of like what's not working, but he wouldn't tell me, well, how could we address it? Or because I think part of a good feedback from your boss, especially, is when they point out something that is missing or that could be improved, but then they kind of put you in a position to improve it or help you improve it or kind of guide you to the right resources so that you can improve it. So maybe this is just a special case, but yeah, what you said is pretty helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually curious to know what is or what would be their response if you say, what are some areas that is not working? What type of response do they tend to give?
Yeah, for example, very generic. So let's say he would come back and say, well, you need better product vision. And I would say, well, that's good. I know that maybe I lack in that department, but how can I get there? He wouldn't have any follow-ons in terms of like how I can get there. He would just kind of point out what's missing.
My suggestion for that, and I know that that could be very frustrating too. My suggestion would be to come up with ideas where you say, okay, these are some things that I've researched or talked to other people on how I can improve that. What are your thoughts on these strategies? And they get their opinion. So they can say, yes, this is good, or this is not good. And I would say, yeah, try that. Try to make it as easy as possible for them to give you feedback. And if not, I would say accept it, but don't give up there. Try to talk to others who might be able to share similar feedback with you. And again, every now and then take it to the same person and say, what are your thoughts? Or every now and then say, okay, do you think it has improved now? I've tried these things, and show it and show the results if it's been improved, if that's something that you can report on, and try to get feedback indirectly. Sometimes that's how you have to do it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Does anyone have any question? Cool. Well, I think this was very helpful, and I think people don't realize how important it is to both give feedback as a manager or as just a colleague or individual, but also be very receptive to feedback as well. So I think it could be a great, as you mentioned perfectly, growth mindset or have the growth mindset. Um, so I think this is a very important topic and one that we certainly should both learn as receiver, but also as um, providers or givers of feedback. So this was very helpful. Thanks for sharing your experience with us. Um, I know we have like 2 minutes. Does anyone want to talk about some other topics that we can discuss? Let's see, we have one question or
Hmm.
any cultural gotchas with feedbacks?
Do you mind elaborating a little bit more on what the question is?
What I mean by that is if you're trying to get a feedback from, let's say, an American white person versus a European white person versus an Indian or a Japanese, are there any like learnings on how to deal with different groups differently?
Hmm. I love that question. I would say always remember that what we discussed today about amygdala hijack, these are all universal because as human beings, we all experience that. So, on the points that it's about body language, being mindful, trying to be present, know that these are going to be pretty much the same, but each person might react differently. But when it comes to cultural differences, or even I said any type of differences that are like personal, I would say when you're working with someone who, especially you're going to have a longer term relationship with, always ask them what are their preferences, what does this mean for them culturally, potentially, if you can have those conversations, especially again if the context that you're asking about is with your manager, always have those conversations in one-on-ones. There are some information that you can get or you can guess based on the way that you interact with that person, but I think it's always worth having those conversations. The only thing that just comes to my mind right now, based on my own experience, is that um, it tends to be, it seems like, this is again my own experience, not science, but it seems like in the Western culture, like in Australia I used to work, and also in America, it seems to be a little bit easier to give feedback for people. Doesn't necessarily mean that tendency to want to give feedback is same as being effective feedback givers, but it seems to be easier. Whereas in the culture where I'm coming from, in the Persian culture, it's not as easy. People want to try to probably do some similar things that is a sandwich approach, because we're not used to being direct in our conversations. We want to wrap it up with other positive things around it, and so that makes it a little bit difficult to give and receive feedback. So these are things that I think, based on your own background culture and where your culture background, where you're living in, you can guess. But I say always be open to having conversations and be curious about people's preferences. I love that question. Thank you. And I want to make sure I actually pronounce your name correctly as well. How do you pronounce it?
Rishikesh,
Rishikesh. Very nice to meet you.
thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I
Uh,
actually wanted to ask about something. I know we were wrapping up. If someone wants to go, but I wanted to ask about this toxic positivity. You'd mentioned about feedback. A lot of times, there are people that kind of deny reality and facts and try to be positive, or maybe a little too positive. And there's this kind of air of toxic positivity as opposed to really saying, okay, it is what it is, and just kind of going with it. What's your take on it, or how to deal with that toxic positivity?
So to make sure I understood the question correctly, is it on the giver and the feedback givers side, where they tend to focus on the positive sides and not get into the actual thing that doesn't work?
Right. So minimizing the issue at hand, the subject matter, and saying, oh, well, things are good. These are good with X, Y, and Z, but not necessarily addressing the issue itself.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very important actually. That's why we talked about how much power you can have on the receiving end to use your emotional intelligence, to also use your expertise in whatever project that you're working in, to know that something is not working well and you need that person's feedback, and let them know that, hey, I know that you've been sharing what's working, but I really need you to let me know things that are not working. You're the only person who can help us with that. And let them know that it's going to be okay for them to share things that are not working. And maybe in certain times, in many situations, I think you can reframe it, you can label it differently. Don't call it always feedback if you think that scares away certain people. You can just say, I just want to know things that could be done better way. They're actually going well right now, but it could be better. And you have to work with people's personalities sometimes, and it can be challenging. But try to see what really run experiments with people. That's what you have to do in certain cases, and but get your answers eventually.
Thank you.
Okay,
Appreciate it.
cool. No worries. All right, I want to be mindful of the time. If no one else has questions, can wrap this up, but definitely feel free to email me or book a time on my calendar. Happy to chat.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sana, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We will see you again soon. And if you have any feedback for me or Sana, please send it our way. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you all. Have a good one. Bye.